Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our March CGBN webinar. I hope you're all doing fantastic today. Before we begin, please know that this session is being recorded. To ensure a smooth experience, we kindly ask anyone who is not presenting or part of the panel to mute themselves and turn off their video recording. Our session today will run for an hour and a half. We'll start with the presentations, followed by the Q&A segment for the presenter. Once the Q&A concludes, we will end the recording and transition into the needs and wants segment. If you have listings or trade missions to share, please let us know. We'd be happy to feature them on the CGBN page. After today's session, the recording will be available on the CGBN YouTube channel and the CGBN page. In the meantime, please take a moment to share your information in the chat, including your name, email, phone number, or any needs and wants you'd like to address. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Dimitri Lockman, and I'm the current chair of CGBN, as well as the president-elect for NICAR. Dr. Williams serves as the vice chair of CGBN and will be taking over later this year. I'd also like to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to our past CGBN chairs, Ahmed Badat, Teresa Mueller, and Bill Caden, for their invaluable contributions and continued support. Thank you all for joining us today. Before we get started, I'd like to take a few minutes to turn it over to Ahmed for some introductions to the group. Ahmed?
Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you very much. So I'm going to basically introduce my friend and mentor and the James Bond, I call him James Bond basically, John Gormley. Who is John? John is the CEO of Main Street Realtors, which is the largest realtor organization in Illinois and one of the top 9 in the country. He became Main Street CEO late 2017 and has total of 36 years of experience in association management, with 26 of those years spent at a realtor organization. You know, so one of the things I remember about John, the first time we met as a group was at a conference in Miami, global. And from the day one when John joined us, he became part of this global mission. And so we already thank him. And so Main Street being also a collaborator with NICAR and NASBAR and Heartland. So, you know, we really appreciate the input and his basically experience that he brings to this organization. And so we really look, you know, thank you, John, and thank you to Ramona and also to Alex, who are part of the Main Street group. John, in 2023, was inducted into the Dr. Almanac Bud Smith RCEA Leadership Society of the National Association of Realtors. That is a great achievement. He holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from Louisiana State University and a master's degree in mass communication from Texas State University. John, thank you very much and appreciate you joining us, and it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Ahmed. I really appreciate your kind invitation. And, you know, Ahmed is the godfather of global and commercial real estate. When he calls, you definitely pick up the phone, and he asks for a favor. I'm definitely going to do it. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. This is exciting for me. I've previewed the speaker you're about to see, thanks to Ahmed, and he's pretty awesome. He's going to be talking about key risks to watch in 2025. Geopolitical takes center stage. And I have prepared just some very brief opening remarks about the topic. You know, as we navigate through an increasingly complex global landscape, understanding the interplay between geopolitics and business has never been more crucial. The world is witnessing seismic shifts, ranging from trade wars to sanctions to political instability, rising nationalism. These factors not only shape the political climate, but also have profound implications for businesses, influencing everything from supply chains to investment strategies. And so in today's complex world, there's a variety of issues that highlight the multifaceted nature of geopolitical risk. So if I were a betting man, and I haven't seen Arun's slide deck, really, I just saw the title slide a little while ago, I would bet that our esteemed speaker today is going to touch on the current state of global affairs, perhaps examining tensions in regions such as Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Asia, all these things that could impact markets and operational decision-making. He may also choose to discuss strategies for risk mitigation and how businesses can adapt to these ever-evolving challenges. We don't know, but we're about to find out here in a few minutes. So just in closing my brief remarks, I want to emphasize that, these geopolitical risks are scary, and the confluence of all of them at once definitely pose challenges for businesses, but they also present opportunities and innovation and resilience. And so looking forward to today's program, and thanks again for having the opportunity to be part of this. Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you, Dimitro. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, John. Go ahead, Dimitro.
Perfect. So as John mentioned, today's webinar is called Geopolitical Risks Impacting the Business Environment, presented by Arun. Just to give you a quick little recap of Arun. Arun is based out of Singapore, specializes in geopolitical risk assessments for corporate and financial clients across sectors like banking, energy, retail, and manufacturing. With expertise in ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance due diligence, market entry, and political risk analysis, Arun has been featured in Bloomberg, CNBC, and BBC World News. He holds degrees from McGill University and London School of Economics. Without further ado, I turn it over to Arun.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for that introduction. And John, I think you summarized the presentation already, so I'll do my best to do that justice. So thank you for that. Just give me 1 second, folks. I will share my screen. All right, let's see if this is coming up. Okay. I'm just going to turn off my video. Let me know if you can see it.
Yep.
Yep.
You see it? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks very much, everybody. Just before I jump in, my name is Arun Pillai-Essex. So yes, I'm a consultant. I work on a lot of different geopolitical and political risk issues for corporates and investors. Just a little bit about our company, Veris Maplecroft. We are a global risk intelligence firm. So we focus on, like I mentioned, geopolitics, but we also focus on sustainability. And I guess what that means in practice is that we maintain geospatial data sets, so risk indices that cover a number of different thematic areas, from climate change and natural hazards to human rights to political and regulatory risk to security risk issues. We basically like to think of our risk indices as sort of building blocks that align with different client workflows. So for some large manufacturer type clients, they'll use the indices to build out a global supply chain risk assessment. They'll select a number of indices to highlight, what their exposure is to climate change, or what is their exposure to a deteriorating security landscape for their assets. For some of our big tech clients, we've been working a lot on data centers. To what extent is the regulatory environment conducive to place a data center in this market versus that market? We work a lot with energy as well. Energy, just a long-standing consideration has been political risk. They've been some of our earliest clients back when this business was first getting started. On the kind of real estate and physical assets like real estate, we work a lot with institutional investors that have that as part of our portfolio. So we're also familiar with some of those risk issues and how they kind of view the landscape. And for them, our focus has been a lot on kind of security and resilience risk, with the political obviously playing a role as well. In terms of our agenda today, so just on the brief introduction, we'll dive right in. We'll talk a little bit about the international system and why there's this whole discussion around there being cracks within it. And I think understanding the global landscape first kind of helps us understand at the nation state level and kind of some of the regional stuff we've been seeing as well. We'll talk a little bit about conflict afflicted areas. I know that may not have the most specific direct implication for some businesses at the moment, but it's definitely the sharp end of the stick of when we think about political risk. Obviously the end of politics is unfortunately direct conflict. So we'll talk a little bit about what we mean by that and some of the trends we're seeing there. And, no geopolitics presentation cannot focus a little bit on the U.S.-China strategic rivalry, because a lot of what we see now kind of plays into this general framework. And then we'll leave some time for Q&A as well. So just getting things going, we look at the international system generally as one that was, typically backed by U.S. power and influence. There was generally a notion that open markets and trade were sort of the core tenets of a system like this. But we're now moving to a more multipolar, more friction, more barriers type of world. So at the top end of that, we mean kind of the strategic competition between the U.S. and China. Below that, there are, of course, major regional markets that are seeking to adapt and balance between these powers. So I'm thinking here like countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, remaining in some ways kind of non-aligned. I know that has a loaded sort of meaning in the past, but we'll get into what we mean by that. But what we mean also just is countries like even countries like Germany or Japan or Vietnam, which have deep commercial and trade relations with the U.S., but also with Beijing. And whilst they may be reliant on the U.S. security umbrella, they maintain commercial linkages with China as well. So we haven't quite seen a two-polar world at all. It's one in which U.S. and China are kind of locked in a very deep and strategic rivalry, but major regional markets are seeking to kind of balance and hedge, if you will. A lot of the original system that we saw in the past was underpinned by a kind of post-World War II framework of global institutions that would basically seek to arbitrate between countries if they had disputes. So I'm thinking here about the WTO when it came to trade, the UN Security Council when it came to conflict between nation states. But we haven't really seen those institutions act decisively, have we? We've really seen countries dealing with countries, the days of the Security Council arbitrating and kind of coming to a conclusion on a protracted security issue. We haven't really been seeing a lot of that. So in our business, we've been talking a lot about how the fraying of that post-World War II system, what does that mean in practice? So it really means that the world has become more complex, and it's become, as a result for businesses, more unpredictable. So today we'll go through some of the trends that we're seeing amidst this kind of unpredictable world. So just looking at the slide right here. So in 2025, we mentioned geopolitical battlegrounds are kind of emerging and they're burgeoning, and it's really showing up in our data set. So our political risk data set has seen an enormous increase in risk for close to 100 countries. So we measure around 198 countries. So our political risk metrics are showing that in the data. It's not just a qualitative inference that we're making. Like, our data is actually reflecting a world that seems to be heating up as we describe it. And what we mean by political risk are some of these kind of constituent pillars that you're seeing below. An increase in friction and trading between borders, more challenges to government authority, resource nationalism, basically the notion of state intervention in strategic sectors, much more incidents of civil unrest. And so, as you can see in the slide, just a number of different kind of parts to what we mean by political risk and sort of rising risk along that. Looking at the next slide, one of the kind of key pillars of what we mean by political risk in this sort of changing world is the role of international trade being really a geopolitical battleground. So just as we've seen, of course, in the past few weeks, steel and aluminum tariffs were raised by 25% by the new administration. There's pledged introduction of reciprocal tariffs on April 2nd. All the sort of mood music there suggests that those will in fact be applied. But of course, we've seen a bit of volatility when it comes to the trade tariff decision making by this administration. But for all intents and purposes, April 2nd is a really key signal to see if they will move ahead with reciprocal tariffs. There's also the sectoral level tariffs, which are also potentially coming down the pipeline. We're thinking here on pharmaceuticals and semiconductors that the administration has also said, on top of the reciprocal tariffs, there could also be these sectoral level tariffs. So all that to say is the sort of trade and tariff policy that we're seeing out of the administration is definitely putting pressure on globalization. So i.e. the reversing of the trend of deepening cross-border trade and capital flows. So what we're seeing is that businesses have been trying to kind of diversify their operations and supply chains and face, they're trying to sort of see in which markets can they kind of temper or find ways in which they're not as exposed to this sort of tariff and rising barriers. And what we're seeing is that there's been a lot of what we call these kind of connector economies. So Mexico and Vietnam have been great examples of this over the past several years. So amidst the kind of rising barriers, ostensibly mostly between US and China, a lot of businesses have been deploying a kind of China plus one strategy where they're placing their factories and other assets in these kind of connector economies to then sell their products into the US market. I know the administration has been looking at Mexico and seeking to kind of downplay or apply pressure so that that kind of connector economy issue isn't as used in this new under this new administration, but it's definitely something in which we're seeing a lot of change within. So I think what we want to see on this slide is that amidst all these different emerging markets, and we've taken kind of the share of global manufacturing just as sort of a nice way of demonstrating all these different massive markets, but also just placing them on our political risk data set. And you can see that a lot of them have shown deterioration as well. So it's just to say that, we're living in a world where political risks are not just in the US and China and others, but also in these emerging markets, we've seen a kind of sort of a deterioration as well. So it's a bit of a sort of a gloomy outlook here when it comes to our general landscape, but we can dive in if there's any specific questions around certain countries or why that deterioration is for a specific state. So we mentioned a little bit about trade and how that's kind of one of the pillars that we're seeing in terms of rising political risk. And, I think it's just fair to say that you can just look on the left of the chart and just see how many more interventions there have been, tariffs and also non-tariff barriers over the past several years. I mean, we think back, to the post-1990 landscape, there was just rapid trade liberalization. China, joined the WTO in 2001. It was sort of seen as this high water mark for open trade borders and capital flows. But, since that time, geopolitics has just come in and that's no longer the world that we live in. So cross-border restrictions on national security grounds have shot up. In the 2020s, we've seen an average of 5 trade agreements a year. That's less than half of what we used to see in the 2000s. The average tariff rate between China and the US is kind of 3 to 8 times higher than it was in 2017. I think that's even higher now, since given the sort of new tariffs and the reciprocal ones that China has imposed over the past week or so. And of course, with the war in Ukraine, there's just been a sweeping sanctions regime imposed on Russia since that time. So the world is really I want to emphasize this notion of barriers kind of coming up. On the right-hand side, it's important to note that, it's not just tariffs when we talk about barriers to trade. It's also things like subsidies and export subsidies, which are also a different way of intervening within an economy to kind of support a particular industry or protect a particular industry from sort of the global trade market. So it's important also, a lot of the headlines are focused on tariffs, but it's important to think about these other barriers as well. So what does that mean also, just in terms of, spend a little bit of the past slide showing emerging markets, but just on looking at kind of democracies as well, Western democracies, industrialized West, whatever we want to call it, our data sets are also showing kind of a deterioration across a number of our regulatory risk metrics. So we're just basically want to show that, with rising barriers, there's also slowing growth, and we've seen a lot of new elections over the past electoral super cycle last year. There's been a lot of new governments, and a lot of these new governments have been intervening in the economy in various ways. So we've seen, some of our indicators show some sort of worsening on some specific metrics of the regulatory environment. So just again, want to emphasize this notion that we're moving from kind of this idea of open markets, or this ambition towards open and free, towards more closed and more intervention at the country level. So these new governments that have come in from last year, they've come in with a lot of expectations from their governments, but a lot of them are seeking to maintain stable operating environments. And there was also, with COVID, just a lot of pent-up stresses on the system when it came to socioeconomic stresses, price pressures, inflation, and a lot of the responses from governments have been to, expand the socioeconomic transfer system, the welfare regime, and the like, which is obviously plays an important role and has its own benefits. But on a business side, just specifically looking at business, we've seen a lot more intervention as well in terms of impeding the environment for the private sector. So looking at, so that's a little bit about trade. Again, just moving from open to more closed. We want to also just spend a little bit of time on the conflict side of things. And here, I don't want to, what we're just showing here is our indices for a specific indicator, conflict intensity. These are our 10 worst performing markets, which I think you would all agree, this is based on what, which is quite obvious. These are jurisdictions that have seen tremendous stress and conflict and long simmering tension. So there's no surprise here, but it's just to show that these situations aren't necessarily improving. There's just been deterioration over the past few years. We also want to show this map because it kind of emphasizes particular issues around the amount of total landmass that's been impacted by conflict has gone up. So this specific index looks at conflict intensity, and one of our major inputs into that is the proportion of territory in which armed conflict is occurring. And that's increased from about 2.8% of the globe to around 4.6% of the globe, which obviously are small numbers, but I mean, for us, it's a doubling of the size of the world in which there is an active conflict. So it's quite a shocking shocking revelation, really, that is sort of a data-led thing. So this is based on a lot of data aggregation that we use from FactSet and from particular vendors that focus just on monitoring active conflicts. And there's a sort of a conflict corridor that you can see centered around the Sahel and East Africa, which has doubled in size since the start of 2021. Of course, there's no single cause. I mean, you'll see here Burkina Faso, Mali, there's civil wars in Sudan, issues in Ethiopia. There's no single reason. These are all highly complex countries and highly complex conflicts, but we just wanted to show, that the issue of conflict in the world, unfortunately, we've seen an uptick, and it's backed up by the data. So it's not just a general inference that we're trying to make. And, it's not necessarily that these conflicts are just there, not impacting the business landscape. Of course, they are as well. Whilst the direct exposure of publicly listed companies to conflict is currently quite limited, we actually have a tool that measures this, and there's around 4 or 5% of publicly listed assets have some direct exposure to a conflict zone. Oil and gas companies having kind of the highest exposure. But, when you think about the Houthis in Yemen and the campaign to target Western shipping in the Red Sea, that's created, a lot of stress on that particular trade flow, and insurance premiums for shipping have gone up as a result. But you also look at, of course, the Ukraine conflict, which has, totally upended energy markets. And we've seen, huge shifts in global energy as a result of that as well. So the impact on business from conflict isn't just some limited thing. These things are quite real. So if you see just on our global map there, everything that's yellow or in reddish is where there's sort of a concentration of a conflict or a live conflict. All this sort of data, by the way, if there's any interest in it, just please let me know. I'm happy to provide trial access or just, share that later on. Let me just pause right there. Is there any immediate questions on those two things, or should I can just wait until the end? Probably that's the easiest.
Arun. So, talking about tariffs and So on the reverse side, have you found any pause in terms of, investment coming to the U.S.?
Yeah, on the tariff issue, there is no specific metric right now that's come out in terms of, like, for example, FDI or greenfield investment that we can just say this is directly correlated with the tariff actions that you've seen over the past 6 weeks, because it's too new. But we have seen a lot of just general indicators of business sentiment, consumer sentiment. We've seen the equity markets. I think it's a reasonable assertion to say that it has created uncertainty. I mean, I just saw the OECD came out with the U.S. economic outlook, and they've reduced their our GDP growth forecast. They've cut that, for example. So is all directly tied to sort of the tariff volatility and pressure. So the administration themselves, I think, are now saying there is going to be short-term pain anyways, right? So I would just point to those sort of sentiment indicators and some of those metrics and some of the revised growth outlooks. But in terms of kind of greenfield investment in FDI, I think it'll be interesting to see those figures come out. I think, maybe in 6 months or so, we can see some real numbers.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. What I want to just show here, I mean, going back to the U.S.-China thing, trying strategic competition, I mean, it's such an enormous issue, but what I'm showing here is kind of our interstate tensions model, and what we have here is a charting of one input into that model, which is this pretty interesting input called verbal conflict indicator, in which it measures all the official comments made by officials in the Biden administration, for example, what you're seeing here, and officials in Beijing. You can see Trump's first term as well. Anything that's viewed as a negative or a criticism or some sort of verbal conflict, which has a specific definition in this model, is picked up. So you can see kind of that there's always a lot of these comments, and you can see some peaks and troughs amidst a very high baseline there. But it's just to say that we are in a period of tension between the U.S. and China, and I think it's fairly obvious to everybody that that's the case. But it's nice to see, from my perspective, just the data kind of backing that up and showing that. But also just briefly on the U.S.-China, the way we discuss it with our clients is kind of try to create a typology. So when we look at U.S.-China, we think about, okay, is there the de-risking of supply chains? So China plus one, companies diversifying supply chains to mitigate the risk of disruption from this issue. They're deciding on the level of exposure they're prepared to accept, kind of at a product input level from these tariffs. And when those thresholds are crossed, then they'll seek alternative suppliers or supply chains. But of course, it's difficult to anticipate kind of what sectors will be more exposed than others. But I think in this new Trump 2.0 era, given the kind of blanket tariff era that we're in, all barriers are sort of rising at a certain level. So whether or not, that kind of parsing of the tariff policy is actually a strategic thing that corporates and financial institutions should be doing is maybe not as useful in this new era, because tariffs are just going up across the board. And Trump 1.0, there was a lot of exemptions, a lot of country exemptions, a lot of sector exemptions after, summits and the like. At the moment, we're really just seeing kind of this new blanket thinking around tariffs. So that's kind of on the trade tariff piece. But we also look at capital markets. This geopolitical alignment has really done a lot to divert capital flows generally. After 2018, there was a rapid drop in FDI to China from the US, as you would imagine. But also there was, with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, a lot more financial sanctions regime by the West imposed globally, which has kind of also fueled an interesting backlash. So what we've seen is with the US and EU really seeking to restrict access to global financial infrastructure. So I'm thinking here around sort of the cross-border payment system. SWIFT, if we remember during the war, that was one thing in which the early parts of the war in which the West was seeking to kind of remove Russia's access to SWIFT. We've seen in the subsequent years, countries like China are developing their own version of SWIFT. They're kind of developing a parallel financial architecture that can kind of insulate them from some of these sanctions regimes that the U.S. and the EU are leading. India has also even taken steps to establish their own payment system. Russia has, of course, as well. So we have the trade discussion, we have the capital markets discussion, and part of the capital markets discussion is also this notion of dollar hegemony. And we've been seeing a lot of that in the Trump administration, Trump 2.0 discussion around ensuring that the dollar is the reserve currency of global transactions. It certainly is. It definitely is. It remains to be the case. But, countries like Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, they've started making payments for imports and exports with China in the renminbi. UAE and Saudi Arabia have pledged or had spoken about perhaps using more of the renminbi for their oil and gas export sales. There's the threat of that, at least. We've seen a lot of energy in this new administration around ensuring that doesn't happen, but it's something to watch. And I think a lot of people are spending time thinking about the equity market when they're looking at the influence of Trump 2.0 on tariff policy. But, we should also look at the bond market. And, our treasury bills are owned, a lot of them are owned by China and other major economies. Hedge funds hold around 10, 11% of U.S. treasuries. If there's volatility, that's something that we want to track. The equity market is one thing, but the bond market, I think, is the kind of the bigger signal of to what extent are we going to see, change from this administration if there's sort of volatility there. And lastly, I just want to make a brief comment on kind of data localization, and I don't know if yourselves have also kind of experienced this sort of risk issue, but data localization is becoming a big issue, and certainly in a world that's fracturing on between U.S., China, and others. Governments are seeking to maintain kind of digital sovereignty, and there's been a lot more protectionist flavor to data localization mandates, and it's just something that we're kind of, it's a signal of this more fragmented world, is different jurisdictions with different data localization requirements is something that I think we should all just be cognizant of. What we want to just show in this slide is because we're a sustainability business as well. So yes, we're talking about political risk, geoeconomic fragmentation, geopolitics, etc. When businesses are looking at other economies to hedge or to sort of see to ensure that perhaps they're looking at this China plus one idea. Mexico and Vietnam were always big examples that were cited, but just moving your factory or investing in these economies isn't just not laden with some risk, and of course there are sustainability issues here. And so what we've put here is just some of our indices that capture distinct human rights issues, and just seeing where those countries score is that they're scoring unfortunately on the high risk. So it's just to ensure that businesses take those risks into account, that they seek to mitigate them, that they work with appropriate suppliers and follow not only national laws but international standards as well. So this is just a slide to kind of evoke that notion around sustainability. And I just want to kind of conclude before we jump into the Q&A is that geopolitics can mean a lot of different things, and it can be a bit confusing when it's deployed as a risk for business. So on this slide, we're just sort of looking at geopolitical risk in the middle and kind of what does it mean in three planks: governance and political risk, so at the executive branch level, or policy uncertainty and things like that. Then the regulatory framework, which of course I think we all know kind of what that means in practice. And then the sort of conflict related pillar. And all of those three pillars, of course, interact and have overlap, but that's just our general conception of geopolitical risk. And then, when we think about businesses, customers, supply chain operations, how does that all interact together? And so there are direct and there are indirect impacts. And what we're trying to do in our consulting is always just bring it back to a slide like this and think about what exactly are the impacts. Okay, I've identified them. Then now what can I do to mitigate them? So I think there was a mention at the beginning of this around opportunity. We've spent a lot of time here just talking about risk, but there's also a lot of opportunity as well to run a better business when these risk issues are taken into consideration, because it only makes the business more resilient and more and stronger. So with that, let me just pause there and then take any questions about anything in the deck or otherwise.
Aro, based on information you oversee, right? What has been the most surprising insight based on your experience for you? Just curious.
Yeah, I think for me, I think the biggest one was this. I was really surprised to see so many countries that we monitor see an uptick in political risk, or the constituent inputs into what we consider political risk. I think it was all, last year we saw however many elections, 30 to 50 elections. We're still living in a kind of post-COVID environment where people were upset about inflation, and there was a lot of civil unrest. There was a lot of change in the politics, and the fact that that's sort of reflected in the data set kind of was encouraging about the data, but also kind of a bit worrying as well, in that, I think we're living in a very, in a time of uncertainty and change. And I think with uncertainty, there's always a bit of issues around that. It always reflects itself in the political landscape. So that's what I would say.
Sure, thank you. And then Dr. William, I think you're muted. There you go.
Okay, I have a question about the if there's legal conflict, and say for a development project, how long does it take it to go to a court and to have some type of issue resolved from that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So usually some of the larger businesses that we're dealing with, if there's a dispute within the jurisdiction that they're operating in, they usually have a clause in there that they'll seek international arbitration. So they'll seek to bring that dispute with the government. And I'm talking about at a big level here. So like a large company has a legal issue with, typically if they can't go through the local courts, and usually they choose not to because they don't want that. And they've included clauses so that they can bring it to an international arbitrator. That's the mechanism that they would use, because they feel as if there's a better chance at a fair hearing. If it's a smaller company or a sort of a local company versus another, then they would just be going through, the local judicial system and process. But again, I think for some of these larger emerging markets where there's a lot of foreign business, very, very rarely are they seeking to go through the domestic route, just because the number of court cases that there's huge backlogs. India, I think, has one of the largest commercial dispute backlogs in the world. Thousands of cases have yet to be heard. So if it's a big enough business, they're seeking to kind of go internationally.
So would that take a year?
Oh yeah, good question. Yeah. That's such a good question.
So, your money is tied up for a period of time. So
yes, that's right.
In U.S. courts, that could be from 12 months to 18 months. So are you saying that this could be quickly, or it could be a lot longer?
A lot longer, typically. Yeah, if it's going to an international arbitration process, I think it would take a lot longer, and it also would depend on. I think it would depend on. I'm just trying to think of some kind of more recent examples, but my understanding of an international business investing, I'm thinking about emerging markets here. If there's a dispute, it can take a number of years. But I don't have that. I don't have a better approximate number for you. But I know that data does exist. Like we could look at foreign business, international arbitration, average length of time to settle disputes, and I'm sure there'll be a range of a figure there.
Great, perfect. Anybody else has any other questions? Let me see if there's anything in the chat. There's nothing in the chat at the moment. Okay, we'll continue on. Or is this? Did we finish off, or there's still more stuff to the PowerPoint?
No, so the PowerPoint, I just want to end with, I have if people are interested in the political risk outlook that we've produced, which is an outlook for the year, it dovetails with some of the stuff we spoke about today. There's a QR code. You can download it for free. And so just, if there's any interest or you want to dive in a little bit more into some of this, please do access the QR code. But I'm happy to answer any questions generally about, if it doesn't have to do with the slides, but if there's any other questions around anything else, political risk, geopolitics, very happy to answer them if there are any.
Perfect. Let's see. I guess one last. Do we have any other questions?
So
on that. Okay.
Do you think we are in a period of uncertainty now? I mean, there's just too many unknowns in terms of what's going on between the U.S., Mexico, Canada. I mean, just in our neighborhood here. So is it kind of a period of wait and see?
April 2nd is coming soon. So I think I've told our clients, I'm certainly looking at April 2nd as a big moment for this administration, because I was very surprised to see, not surprised, but I think the steel and aluminum tariffs were kind of a canary in the coal mine moment. I think it definitely signaled that they are very much serious about what they intended to do with trade, and that's fair enough, because they campaigned on this. So, they have pledged to raise trade barriers, and so they are seeking to do that. April 2nd is the reciprocal tariffs, and I think Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, made a comment today around that each country will get a number, so to speak. So there will be an average tariff rate that will increase, and so if they go ahead with that on April 2nd, then I think that signals a lot of things about what's coming in the future around other policy priorities as well. So it is uncertain, but also I think there's been more clarity past week. And certainly I think we'll see that in the next few weeks as well.
Thank you. There is one more question from Tatiana. She's asking, please tell me more about the human rights and their influences to this subject.
Oh, yeah, of course. Human rights is one of the biggest things that we monitor and capture. You cannot see a deteriorating political environment and not also see a relationship to the human rights landscape. That's 100%. Usually when there's volatility in the politics, unfortunately we see an influence in the social, especially in some of the emerging markets that we track and monitor. So the way we think about it is we look at the influence on labor rights. Labor protections are a big indicator and something that we measure very closely, and that we report back to the companies that we work with, and then we look at forced labor issues, wage issues. Those are all extremely important risk topics that I think every big business, when they're investing or making market entry decisions, are seeking to look at that and ensure that they're not running afoul of those. Well, we'd like to think not running afoul of those standards. So that's very important. And that's not only complying with local labor laws and national level labor laws, but also kind of best practice standards and the like. And just as an addendum to that is that a lot of the European regulations now are such that if you're a big business with some exposure to the European market, you're having to disclose so much more than you would have in the past. You would have to disclose information around your supply chain, who your vendors are, along these kind of human rights areas, and increasingly on some of the climate related stuff as well. I know that there's tremendous pushback against these disclosure requirements at the same time, but it's not to say that that's not where the movement is. So being a large business or a financial investor at the moment in emerging markets, there's a lot more responsibility. And a lot of that is tied up in human rights protections and disclosure.
So to that question, Arun, so what about, when you're talking about human rights, do you also gauge in terms of, or do you use local or global human rights organizations for things
Definitely.
like discrimination in the workplace, discrimination in housing, discrimination based on your sexual orientation, discrimination based on your religion, your race? I mean, so these are things that we are really very conscious of, but I don't think it plays the same role when we're dealing with our foreign partners.
Sure. No, I mean that's a great question. I mean, so I'll answer it in two parts. On the one part, we look at those global international standards organizations and what they say about all of these jurisdictions very closely, because that informs the scores that the countries receive along human rights indicators, because we follow a structure, process, outcome, methodology. Structure: has the country signed up to international treaties around anti-discrimination or what have you? Process: do they have an enforcement body to enforce human rights laws in the country? And then outcome: okay, you might have all the laws and the enforcement, but is it happening? So the outcome, measuring how much of these violations occur. So on the scoring, yes, that's absolutely very important. In practice, I mean, I'm based in the Asia Pacific region. I think it's fair to say that there are labor risks in Southeast Asia, and most big corporates operating here are very aware of those risks. We hope that companies are taking it as seriously as we are taking it, but it's not to say that there isn't these risks that are still prevalent in supply chains and operations. So I think we're always trying to do better. But us on the data side, we're just trying to reflect the world as it is in the numbers. Companies, I think, are trying to adhere to the laws and hopefully to international best practice standards. Whether or not they miss the boat in some areas, I'm sure that's the case. We've all seen the news whenever companies are found to be non-compliant in those areas. So definitely a work in progress. But I'll just say anecdotally that I've been looking at sustainability for over 12 years. The conversation 12 years ago to now has changed completely, and a lot of these risk issues are much more discussed and acted upon and worked upon. So maybe there's a sort of a positive outlook with regards to that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, because that's tough issue to basically monitor. But I mean, I'm sure there's organizations on the ground that basically be able to give you, so the rag trade. When you look at Bangladesh, being one of the big suppliers in the clothing industry, and we've had some unfortunate events take place in the last few years. Do you think it's got to a stage now that it satisfies the criteria in terms of, say, practices, child labor?
Yeah, I mean, I will just say, kind of off the record, we worked with a retail client, and I know that they basically divested their sort of garment supply chain from Bangladesh just because of those incidents that happened several years ago, and there was just a feeling the reputational risk of continuing to operate there was too difficult. I know that also Bangladesh has enacted a number of reforms since those incidents to strengthen the scrutiny and operations of those factories. So, it's tough. I think progress was being made, but then I think there was also a fear factor for some Western companies when it came to operating there again. But just on the sustainability point and the human rights point, one of the risks that we have noticed over the past several years is that there's more fiscal constraints. Governments post-COVID, because they had to put a lot, COVID, we all remember that governments were having to, do a lot more direct transfers to people because the economy was basically shut down. But for some poorer countries, they have less buffers to do that. And unfortunately, their public finances are very stretched. And in those situations, some of the things were getting cut. Some of the socioeconomic protections were getting cut. And unfortunately, some of the human rights issues were kind of, exacerbated by that. So it's a sort of it's always a delicate issue. But it's also conditional on the performance of the economy and its ability to make progress in these areas.
Thank you.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
thank you. This was amazing. And thank you for, again, joining us again. A lot of great
Sure.
insight and great input, great presentation. With that being said, before we end the presentation, I just want to say a big, big, big thank you again to Arun. Thank you for joining us and providing very insightful
Thank you,
information. Please join us next month, April 15th. We'll be having another CGBN webinar, and we will share that with everybody later on. Other than that, we can end the recording and we